Thank you. Thank you all so very, very much. Thank you all very, very much. Please, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for that overly generous introduction. And as the old joke goes, the only one to believe it would be my mom if she were here. But thank you all so very much. And let me begin in a way that speakers should not, by apologizing for being late. It's all the president's fault. Quite seriously, we've just been in I've just spent 2.5 hours meeting with the president and Prime Minister Netanyahu and his team, and then alone in my office for the better part of an hour with just the Prime Minister and myself, talking about the issues that are of mutual concern. And so I truly apologize for keeping you waiting. Mr. President, Jeremy, thank you for the invitation, allowing me to be here. And I also understand a member of Knesset, Galon, is here. Galon, I'm not sure where you're sitting, but if you are here, thank you. This is what we call a busman's holiday. Having to hear another politician speak, I apologize, but you're very gracious. You're very gracious to be here. And also, I understood that my friend Tim Kaine was going to be here, but there's a little thing going on up in the hill right now. Before I begin, I do want to talk about the Middle East, but I'd like to say, I look out here and I know a number of members of J Street. And I don't want to paint you all with the same brush, but I understand your interests far exceed just what's happening in the Middle East and Israel. I know you're concerned about every progressive notion that this government is trying to pursue. I mean that sincerely, and I want to thank you. I want to thank you. There is no contradiction between being progressive and being a supporter of Israel. None. None at all. Folks, we're all gathered here because we have something, I would argue, many things in common, but like you, the President and I are absolutely devoted to the survival and security of the Jewish state of Israel. And I've now served with 8 presidents of the United States. And I can assure you, none, and this is not hyperbole, this is a fact, none have done more to protect the state of Israel as my friend, President Barack Obama, has done. And this commitment is unrelenting. And that's why we've worked so hard to make sure Israel keeps its qualitative military edge in spite of the cuts in our own budget. That's why our security leaders, both military and intelligence leaders, have never had a closer relationship than the one that exists now between Israel and the United States, including the largest ever joint military exercises with Israel. Austere Challenge was the name of the exercise. And that's why Israeli men, women, and children, whose only defense in the past from rockets were bomb shelters, they're now protected by an Iron Dome missile defense system, saving lives. And that's why President Obama chose Israel for his first visit in his second term. That's why John Kerry has been there 6 times in the last 6 months. And that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu said today in the Oval Office what he said in the past, that no president has done more for the security of Israel than President Barack Obama. He called it unprecedented cooperation and reaffirmed it today. So I say here at J Street what I would say anywhere and do say everywhere. America's support for Israel's security is unshakable, period. Period, period. And I want to make it clear, and those of you who've been around a while have heard me say this before over the years, it's not based merely on our moral commitment to Israel, but on our mutual national security interest. Ladies and gentlemen, if there were not an Israel, we would have to invent one in order to make sure our interests were preserved. And that support is grounded on values we share as vibrant democracies, where freedom of speech and thought are protected, where individual rights are recognized, where there's a sense of collective responsibility. And I'm excited about seeing so many citizen activists assemble here today at this conference. Your involvement represents the cornerstone of democratic participation, and your presence is not only welcome, it's reassuring. I'm particularly excited because I told that there are somewhere close to 700 college students here today. Is that true? Stand up. College students, stand up. It's important you're here. It is critically important you're here. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. For you continue to infuse new blood from generation to generation into this cause. You are welcome, and your ideas are welcome as well. Like all of you, I believe Israel's ultimate security, as my friend the ambassador said, requires a just and lasting peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. When I was not much older than you college students here, I was a 30-year-old senator, as the ambassador pointed out, I did go and have the opportunity, it was a great privilege, to sit for a long time in Golda Meir's office. And those who are closer to my age will remember, Prime Minister Meir was a chain smoker, and she had a set of maps behind her, those kind that have multiple maps on it you can pull up and down. And I spent well over an hour and a half as she smoked and pulled those maps up and down, pointing out how Israel was surrounded. At that time, 6 million Jews in Israel and 60 million Arabs surrounding it. Much has changed. And during the entire time, there was a young man sitting to my right. His name was Ikshop Rabin, who was her aide at the time. And after going through and reading me letters from the war front of young men and women who were killed in the previous encounter, I guess you could tell I was somewhat demoralized. And she all of a sudden looked at me and she said, and those of you who met her before, you'll appreciate this, she said, "Senator, would you like a photo opportunity?" And I looked at her and I said, "Well, yes, ma'am." And we stood up, and if you've been in the Israeli Prime Minister's office, there's double doors that open up into a sort of a large hallway. And she opened the doors, and we stepped forward, and all the cameras, the television crews, and photographers were assembled there. And she started to talk and tell about the conversation we just had, and that I had just come from Egypt. I was the first one allowed to come across the Sinai. And she went on for a few minutes. And then, while I was looking at her while she was speaking, continuing to look straight ahead, she said, only loud enough for me to say, "Senator, don't look so worried. We Jews have a secret weapon." It's a true story. We Jews have a secret weapon in our conflict with the Arabs. And I thought she was about to tell me about some weapon system. And she turned while they're snapping pictures, because I didn't say anything, she turned and she said, "We have no place else to go. We have no place else to go." And ladies and gentlemen, that's why a lot of us, people like Lou Sussman and my good friend Michael Adler is with me today, and Dan Shapiro, our ambassador to Israel, and Martin Indyk, who I just left at the White House. That's why we and so many of you have been engaged in this struggle to secure Israel's independence as a Jewish state for our entire careers. Because we know what Golda Meir said to me, well, almost 40 years ago, was absolutely correct. Although the threats to Israel faces today are materially different than on that day when I met with Golda Meir, they are no less formidable. An international effort to delegitimize the state of Israel, a nuclear Iran seeking nuclear weapons, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, with stockpiles of sophisticated weapons pointed at Israel from the north and the south, Hezbollah, another terrorist organization targeting Israelis around the world from Argentina to India to Bulgaria for no other reason than they are Jewish. And all this is happening in the context that has dramatically changed the Middle East over the last several years. The region has gone from the forced calm of dictatorship to the euphoria of revolution, and now into the realities that are far more complex. These changes were not caused by Israel or by the United States, but nonetheless, these changes in the Middle East affect both of our national security interests. We've seen the growing threat of the spread of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear, into the hands of stateless actors, or maybe worse still, failed states. We've seen ancient tensions between Sunni and Shia resurface in the Muslim world like no time in the last several generations. We've seen spontaneous revolutions that held great promise stall, relapse, turn violent, with the struggle between political Islam and the more secular vision of nationhood. If you have a few moments, I'd like to speak to you about these sources of instability and the strategies the President and I believe we need to deal with them. First, with regard to the threat of weapons of mass destruction, a nuclear-armed Iran would pose an existential threat to Israel, an unacceptable danger to world peace and security, including the likelihood of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, making everyone less secure. That's why the President rallied the whole world, even though skeptics thought it would not work, to get a UN Security Council behind the most effective sanction regime in all of history, to make it absolutely clear that we will not tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran. We will not allow them to possess nuclear weapons. These sanctions have had a profound impact on Iran's economy, and they have crystallized for the Iranian people as well as the leadership that they have to make a very basic decision. Do they want to continue and deepening international isolation and all the negative consequences that flow from that, or do they want to negotiate their way back into the global economy and the global community? On Friday, President Obama and President Rouhani had the first conversation between an Iranian president and a U.S. president in over 30 years. In that conversation, President Obama conveyed our resolve regarding Iran's nuclear program, but also said, and I quote, "There is a basis for resolution," end of quote. We don't know whether Iran is willing to do what is necessary to get there, but we, along with the permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany, the so-called P5+1, are committed to finding out. President Obama made clear, and I quote, that the test will be meaningful, transparent, and verifiable actions, end of quote. Concrete steps are needed to meet Iran's international obligations. And by the way, it's not just Iran's nuclear program we're concerned about, but it's all weapons of mass destruction, including the enormous stockpile of chemical weapons in Syria, with which Assad launched an unconscionable attack on his own people. In the last 2 years, the United States and the world have been trying to persuade their sponsor, Russia, to act in the mutual interest of the United States, Russia, and all the world in dealing with serious chemical weapons. As late as this summer, Russia blocked an attempt by the United States, a simple UN resolution that merely stated the condemnation of the use of chemical weapons by anyone in Syria. They blocked it. And then came August the 21st. The chemical attacks by the Assad regime killed well over 1,000 people, many of them women and children, and barely 50 miles from Israel's border. At that moment, the president decided this could not stand, and he readied the use of our military to deter Assad's further use of chemical weapons and degrade his capacity if there was no other alternative. But in the meantime, we had a discussion before he left for the G20 in Pittsburgh, where he decided he was going to once again reach out to Vladimir Putin to see if there was an effort toward diplomacy could be done. Diplomacy with Vladimir Putin by doing a simple thing, pointing out that it's as much in Russia's interest as the United States that there be cooperation to remove the chemical weapons stockpiles from Syria. And out of that came the so-called agreed framework that, if honored, will address the threat of Syria's chemical weapons more comprehensively than any military strike could have. As a consequence, Syria has been forced for the first time in its existence to declare that it had a stockpile of chemical weapons and joined the Chemical Weapons Convention. On Friday, after much negotiation on the part of our UN ambassador, on Friday, Russia voted for a UN Security Council resolution legally binding Syria to remove and store its chemical weapons with consequences should they fail. Now, ladies and gentlemen, now it has to be enforced. But now we have, for the first time, the whole world on record as saying it must be enforced. That is the reality of how this all took place. But I'm absolutely certain that it would never have reached this point without the tough, smart leadership of my friend, President Barack Obama. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the violence in Syria exposed the second source of instability beyond weapons of mass destruction in the region, and that is a larger conflict between Sunni and Shia. Let's be clear. The revolution against the Assad regime began not as a secular war, but as a peaceful demonstration by the Syrian people. They were met with brutal suppression by the Assad regime. The violence that has followed has unfortunately empowered the lowest common denominators inside and outside of Syria. al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, representing the extremists on the Sunni side of the equation. Hezbollah and pro-regime militants representing the Shiite and Alawite extremists at the other end. And each side pushing the other to the extreme. The middle is being squeezed out. And the only way to bring the rational middle back in is through international diplomacy, coupled with support for moderate opposition. That's why, in the resolution I referenced on Friday, we insisted on a provision in the UN Security Council resolution endorsing a second Geneva Peace Conference. Because a civil war in Syria does not lend itself to outside military intervention. And these sectarian disputes are not just in Syria. In Bahrain, there are tensions between the Sunni leadership and the Shia community. You see it in Lebanon. Sunni, Christian, Shiite are struggling to stay out of the sectarian proxy war next door, even as Hezbollah sends soldiers across the border to fight. We're concerned because the impact of these tensions could have what they could have on regional stability, on continued growth of extremism, even on the global economy, including a stable energy supply. We approach these problems with a great deal of humility. We cannot impose a solution, but we are working to provide international support to those in the region who are seeking one, so the extremists cannot control the agenda. And that's why we remain focused on Iraq, a country made up of Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. I'm often asked, why do I continue to be so engaged personally in Iraq at the President's request? It's because if Iraq can achieve reconciliation between Sunni, Shia, and Kurd and reintegrate with the broader Arab world, it can be a linchpin of the region where Sunni and Shia can demonstrate they can work together. As bad as the violence remains in Iraq, I would argue that Iraqis have traveled the greatest distance in resolving these internal tensions. And we have an interest in working to ensure that Iraqi tensions do not explode into a conflagration that would empower extremists on all sides in Iraq as well. We have an interest in bringing Iraq together with its Arab neighbors, something I've spent a great deal of time attempting to do. And we're making some progress. As we do this, we have an interest in the long-term security of our partners in the Gulf, and particularly Jordan. We're actually working at all of these, and I'm personally putting in a great deal of time on these issues. The jury is still out, as they say, but I am optimistic. These sectarian tensions have been stirred up in part by a third source of instability in the Middle East. The upheaval we are seeing as people across the region express their yearning for more open societies. There are simmering conflicts between the old entrenched order and those who seek to replace them, and between those seeking political Islam and those with a more secular vision for their countries. This may be the most difficult challenge of all. As I said to the President and others, my grandchildren are going to look back and ask the question 20 years from now, why did they think they could solve the Arab Spring in a couple years? This was decades and decades and decades in the making. We know we can't dictate events, and we don't seek to. But our preference is always for societies where people can breathe free, speak openly, without fear of retribution, where universal rights, women's rights, the rights of religious minorities are protected. Because we believe that these rights are the building blocks of any stable, prosperous country or region. They're the building blocks upon which a stable Middle East will be built, even though we know getting there will be very hard and take time. But that does not say we cannot continue and should not continue to try. These changes are going to require difficult decisions on a case-by-case basis, from President Obama to whomever our next president is and the president after that. Egypt's an example. What to do in Egypt? We will continue to engage with the interim government on issues that matter to us both, including maintaining Egypt's peace treaty with Israel. But the nature of our support also will depend on Egypt's progress toward building an inclusive democracy, keeping the commitment they have publicly made, a new constitution, of free elections. Across the region, the United States will continue to work with those engaged in the generational project of creating more open societies in the Middle East. We'll continue to mobilize international support, and we'll continue to make investments in economic development and reform, including through enterprise funds to jumpstart private investment, empowering moderates, including support for Yemen's national dialogue, and helping the government in Libya and elsewhere build the capacity to have a decent police force to be able to secure their cities and their territory. But this will take a lot of time, and will take a lot of patience. And there is no absolute straight road, in my humble opinion. And in the end, There is no substitute for the people of these countries stepping up to solve their own problems. We cannot want peace in their country more than they do. We cannot want it more than they do. And so, folks, in light of all these developments, some ask us why the President and I still believe we have to work toward an Israeli-Palestinian peace process. All this going on. Why Biden? Why Obama? Why are you so set on trying to revive the peace process? How can it be done now? Well, it'll not surprise you, coming from Biden. Ironically, I believe this very moment may offer the best opportunity for peace. And let me tell you why. It is not the conventional wisdom. I think it offers the best opportunity because the Israeli people and the Palestinians alike are looking around and seeing a region that has incredibly degraded in terms of the risk of rising extremism. And both sides have an interest in a moderate, sustainable outcome. Ladies and gentlemen, think about it. The Palestinian-Israeli issue involves the least ideological and the least sectarian group of Arabs in the entire Middle East. That's why it's important that we use our good offices to bring both sides together as we have toward a two-state solution for two peoples. Israel as a secure Jewish state and a homeland for the Jewish people worldwide. And the state of Palestine as a homeland for the Palestinian people. Each state enjoying security, self-determination, and mutual recognition. I've been in the region like you many, many times. I remain absolutely convinced that that desire of the vast majority of Israelis and the vast majority of Palestinians. But you know, the ambassador kids me about being Irish. They say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Because I'm Irish, I understand. Old hatreds die slowly. I mean this sincerely. Old scars are the hardest ones to paper over. There is now, for good, bad, there is now a state where both peoples have to step back and conclude that not every single solitary grievance that occurred in the past should be visited upon their children. The first time. And so for the first time, both sides are talking directly, and both sides have taken some risks to get where it is today. And I might add, in the meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he publicly thanked the president for insisting on moving forward. Both sides deserve our support, and the process needs our support. If not us, who? If not us, who? And folks, and the leaders on both sides need to know that if they take risks for peace, their people will be behind them, and so will we. To restate the obvious, as we look out across the region, the challenges we face are many and they are significant. That's not new. What is new is that there are now serious efforts underway to solve several of the most important challenges that exist. The removal and destruction of serious chemical weapons, advancing a political solution to a sectarian civil war, supporting independent democracies, a unified Iraq, Sunni, Shia, and Kurd, preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and helping Israeli and Palestinians finally find peace. That is what we're about. And though I hadn't planned to say it in light of the reference of my Irish heritage, let me quote from one of my favorite Irish poets who just passed away, Seamus Heaney. He wrote a poem called The Cure at Troy. And here's what it says. It was really talking about his Ireland, but I view it as the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And the quote in the poem goes like this: history says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Ladies and gentlemen, it's our job to do everything in our power to see that hope and history rhyme, because it is long past time. It is long past time. And I believe with your help, we will get there. So as my grandfather would say, keep the faith. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you for being who you are. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.